Imagine what you could do if you could sustain motivation long term, even when the work is uncomfortable, repetitive, and hard. There would be very little you couldn't accomplish, yet almost no one manages to do this. So instead of asking why people fail, it's more useful to ask who didn't and what did they do differently. David Goggins is one of the clearest examples. Not because he's superhuman, not because he enjoys pain, but because he made a critical shift in how effort itself felt. And this shift is not a life hack, it's a fundamental change in how the brain relates to challenge. To understand it, we need to look at where most people go wrong. Most people work hard for something, for money, for validation, for relief, for the moment it finally ends. Rewards aren't bad, goals matter. But psychology shows us something uncomfortable. Working hard for a reward actually makes hard work feel worse. Because when effort is tied to a future payoff, the brain treats effort as a cost. Something to endure until the real benefit arrives. That framing makes the work feel heavier, more painful, and harder to repeat. Over time, you need more reward to tolerate the same level of effort. This is how motivation collapses. There's a classic Stanford experiment that explains this perfectly. Researchers observed children who already loved drawing. No pressure, no incentives. They drew purely because they enjoyed it. Then the researchers introduced a reward, a gold star, for drawing. The kids drew more, but when the reward was removed, something strange happened. The children stopped drawing, not because they disliked it, but because their brains had reclassified the activity. It was no longer something they enjoyed. It was something they did for a reward. This is the difference between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. When rewards dominate, the brain stops releasing dopamine for the activity itself, and only releases it for the payoff. No payoff, no drive. This is how people unknowingly train themselves to hate effort. Most people tell themselves, I'll grind now so I can relax later. I just need to push through this. I'll be happy once this is done. But this turns effort into punishment, and punishment does not sustain behavior. This is why motivation spikes briefly and then disappears, why people start strong and fade quietly, why discipline feels impossible to maintain. David Goggins did something different. Goggins didn't just increase his tolerance for pain, he changed what effort meant. Instead of viewing suffering as the price to pay for success, he treated suffering as the success. Running wasn't a means to an outcome. Training wasn't a means to approval. Pain wasn't something to escape. Effort was the point. Psychologically, this is massive. He removed dependence on reward. In neuroscience terms, he rewired his dopamine system. Instead of dopamine being released when the task was finished, he trained himself to associate dopamine with engaging in difficulty. That's why he can sustain extreme effort without relying on motivation. When effort itself becomes rewarding, something changes. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop waiting to feel ready. You stop depending on mood. Psychologists call this process orientation, focusing on the act, not the outcome. Research consistently shows that people who orient toward process persist longer, experience less burnout, perform better under stress, because their motivation is internal and renewable. Goggins doesn't ask, what do I get from this? He asks, what does this build in me? That question never runs out of fuel. Most people want the results without the conditioning. They want confidence without evidence, self-respect without repetition, identity without behavior. But the brain doesn't change through insight. It changes through exposure. Repeated exposure to discomfort trains resilience. This is known as stress inoculation. What once feels unbearable becomes normal. That's why Goggins keeps going when others stop. Not because he's motivated, but because effort no longer signals danger to his nervous system. You don't need to be extreme. You don't need to suffer theatrically, but you do need to stop treating effort like something to escape. The moment you stop asking, when does this end? And start asking, what is this shaping in me? That's when one can sustain extreme effort without relying on motivation.